You were 4 years old. You took your brother's toy. Your mother stood over you with that look. Say you're sorry. You didn't feel sorry. You felt angry that he had taken your toy first. But you said it anyway, because refusing would make things worse. I'm sorry. Say it like you mean it. I'm sorry. That was the day you learned that sorry isn't about truth. It's about performance. It's about making other people comfortable. It's about ending conflict even when you're not wrong. 30 years later, you're still performing. You say sorry to your boss for having a doctor's appointment. You apologize to your partner for their bad mood. You say sorry to the waiter when your order is wrong. You apologize for taking up space, for having needs, for existing. You've been trained like a circus animal. Someone cracks the whip of disapproval, and you perform your sorry trick. And you wonder why people don't respect you, why they take advantage of you, why your relationships feel unbalanced, why you feel exhausted after every interaction that involves conflict. It's because you're still 4 years old, apologizing to make the big people happy. But you're not 4 anymore. And this audiobook is your permission slip to stop performing apologies you don't mean. Let me tell you about Michelle. She had 15 years of marketing experience, an impressive portfolio, and recommendations from 3 industry leaders. She was interviewing for a director position at a company she'd admired for years. The interview started well. She answered technical questions confidently. She shared case studies that demonstrated her expertise. The hiring manager seemed impressed. Then came the behavioral questions. Tell me about a time you made a mistake at work. Michelle's face flushed, her shoulders tensed. And before she could stop herself, the apologies started flowing. I'm so sorry, this is actually kind of embarrassing to talk about. I apologize if this makes me sound incompetent, but there was this campaign where I completely miscalculated the budget. I'm sorry, I should have been more careful. I apologize for not catching it sooner. The interviewer's expression shifted. The warmth disappeared. Michelle noticed and apologized more. Sorry, I'm probably oversharing. I apologize. I know you probably want a more concise answer. By the end of the interview, Michelle had apologized 17 times for her coffee being too hot, for taking a moment to think before answering, for her previous employer's budget constraints, for traffic making her 3 minutes early instead of 5. She didn't get the job. The feedback delivered through the recruiter was that she seemed unsure of herself and lacked executive presence. Michelle was devastated. She'd been the most qualified candidate. She'd done everything right, except she'd apologized her way out of the opportunity. What Michelle didn't understand is that every unnecessary apology was a signal, not of humility or accountability, but of submission, of uncertainty, of someone who would be easy to push around. The hiring manager heard those 17 apologies and made a calculation. This person will apologize when challenged. This person will back down under pressure. This person will prioritize being liked over being effective. And they were right. Because Michelle had been training for that exact behavior since she was 4 years old. This is what psychologists call learned behavior. But it's more than that. It's conditioning so deep it feels like part of your personality. You've said sorry so many times that it's become a reflex, a nervous tick, a way of moving through the world. You apologize when you ask questions, when you disagree, when you need something, when you don't need something but someone expects you to, when you're early, when you're on time, when you exist in spaces where other people might be inconvenienced by your presence. The apologies have become invisible to you. You don't even notice them anymore, but everyone else does. Your boss notices. It's why they interrupt you in meetings, why they assign you the work nobody else wants, why they dismiss your ideas without consideration. You've apologized yourself into being the office doormat your partner notices. It's why they've stopped asking what you want to do, why they make plans without consulting you, why they've learned that if they just wait long enough, you'll apologize for being upset and let them off the hook. Your friends notice. It's why they vent to you but never ask how you're doing. Why they cancel plans at the last minute knowing you'll say it's fine. Why you've become the group therapist instead of an equal member. Your children notice. They're learning right now that Boundaries are negotiable. That other people's comfort matters more than your own. That the way to navigate conflict is to make yourself smaller. You're passing on the same programming you received. The cycle continues. But here's what nobody told you when you were 4 years old. There are two completely different types of apologies. And confusing them will destroy your life. The first type is genuine remorse. This is when you've actually done something wrong. When you've hurt someone through your actions or inactions. When you need to take responsibility for harm you've caused. These apologies are powerful. They repair relationships. They demonstrate emotional maturity. They build trust. They're rare, specific, and backed by changed behavior. The second type is submission performance. This is when you apologize to manage someone else's emotions, to avoid conflict, to make yourself smaller, to signal that you're not a threat. These apologies are poison. They erode self-respect. They train others to disrespect you. They create relationship patterns where you're always wrong and they're always justified. Most people learn to apologize from the second category. As children, they were forced to say sorry not because they understood wrongdoing, but because an authority figure demanded it. The apology was about compliance, not conscience. And that pattern never changed. You're still apologizing for compliance, still performing sorry to satisfy other people's emotional demands, still confusing submission with virtue. This is why Michelle apologized 17 times in her interview. Not because she'd done 17 things wrong, but because she'd been conditioned since childhood to apologize whenever she sensed disapproval or tension. The interviewer's slight frown triggered her 4-year-old self, and that 4-year-old responded the only way she knew how. "I'm sorry. Please don't be angry. I'll be good. I promise." Except she's not 4, she's 39. And that apology pattern is costing her everything. Here's the truth that will change your life. Most of the apologies you've made were unnecessary. Not just unhelpful, actually harmful. Every time you apologized for something that wasn't your fault, you taught someone that you accept blame easily. Every time you apologize for having needs, you taught someone that your needs don't matter. Every time you apologize for someone else's bad behavior, you gave them permission to do it again. You've been programming the people around you to treat you worse, and you've been doing it with the word sorry. This audiobook will teach you the difference between genuine remorse and conditioned submission. You'll learn exactly when an apology builds respect and when it destroys it. You will understand why the people who apologize the least are often the most successful in their careers and relationships. But most importantly, you'll learn how to break the apology addiction that has been running your life since you were too young to understand what was being done to you. This isn't about becoming someone who never takes responsibility. This is about becoming someone who knows the difference between responsibility and blame, between accountability and self-abandonment, between being humble and being a target. By the end of this audiobook, you'll be able to walk into any room without apologizing for taking up space. You'll handle conflict without reflexively accepting fault. You'll maintain relationships without constantly managing other people's emotions at the expense of your own. But first, you need to understand what's actually happening in your brain every time you say sorry. Because that apology reflex isn't just a habit. It's a neurological pattern that's been carved into your brain through years of repetition. And understanding that pattern is the first step to breaking it. Every time you say sorry, your brain releases chemicals that feel like relief. That's not humility. That's addiction. Understanding this changes everything. Because once you see the neurological pattern, you realize you're not just being polite. You're chasing a drug. Here's what happens in your brain the moment conflict arises. Someone expresses disapproval. Your boss frowns. Your partner's tone shifts. A friend seems annoyed. Immediately, your amygdala, the brain's alarm system, detects a threat. Not a physical threat. A social threat. And to your ancient brain, social rejection is as dangerous as a predator. For most of human history, being cast out from the tribe meant death. Your nervous system still operates on that assumption. So the amygdala floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart races. Your stomach clenches. Your thoughts spiral. This is the stress response. And it feels terrible. Now, Here's where the apology comes in. The moment you say sorry, even if you've done nothing wrong, your brain registers that you've taken action to resolve the social threat. The other person's face softens slightly, or at least stops showing active disapproval. And your brain releases a cocktail of chemicals designed to reward you for restoring social harmony. Dopamine provides a hit of pleasure. Oxytocin creates a feeling of connection. Serotonin generates calm. The cortisol and adrenaline levels begin to drop. The terrible feeling dissipates. You feel relief, sometimes even a sense of virtue. You handled the conflict. You're a good person who takes responsibility. Everything's okay now, except it's not okay. You just trained your brain that apologizing makes bad feelings go away. And like any reward-based learning, your brain will push you to repeat that behavior. This is classical conditioning. The same mechanism that makes rats press levers for food pellets. The same system that creates addiction to substances, to behaviors, to anything that provides relief from discomfort. You've become addicted to the relief that comes from apologizing. James didn't realize he had a problem until his wife said something that stopped him cold. They'd been married 8 years. Good years, mostly. But lately something fell off. His wife seemed distant, less affectionate, more irritated by small things. One evening after James apologized for the 3rd time in an hour, she put down her book and looked at him. "Can you please stop apologizing for everything?" James was confused. He'd apologized for coming home 10 minutes later than expected, for picking the wrong restaurant, for not having an opinion on what to watch on television. "I'm just trying to be considerate," he said. "No," she replied. "You're trying to manage my emotions, and it's exhausting." She explained that every time he apologized unnecessarily, it put pressure on her to reassure him, to tell him it was fine, to manage his anxiety about whether she was upset. His apologies had become a burden she had to carry. "I married an equal partner," she said. "But somewhere along the way, you became someone who needs constant approval. And I've become responsible for providing it." James felt like he'd been punched, but she was right. He'd spent their entire marriage in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning her mood, preemptively apologizing to avoid any hint of conflict. He thought he was being a good husband. He was actually being an anxious child seeking reassurance from a parent. That night, James couldn't sleep. He replayed every interaction from their marriage. The pattern was undeniable. Apologize, feel relief, repeat. He'd been using his wife as an emotional regulation device, and she was tired of it. His therapist later explained what was happening neurologically. James had developed what's called an anxious attachment pattern in relationships. His nervous system was constantly on alert for signs of disapproval or rejection, and his brain had learned that apologizing brought immediate, if temporary, relief. But here's the problem with that relief. It's temporary, because the apology doesn't address the underlying anxiety. It just postpones it. So the pattern repeats more frequently, with decreasing effectiveness. James needed bigger apologies to get the same relief. He needed to apologize more often. He needed more reassurance. The tolerance was building. This is exactly how addiction works. The substance or behavior that once provided relief stops working as effectively, so you increase the dose. You increase the frequency. And eventually, you're trapped in a cycle that's destroying the very thing you're trying to preserve. The neuroscience reveals something even more troubling. Chronic apologizing doesn't just create addiction. It literally changes your brain structure. Research on learned helplessness shows that when animals repeatedly experience situations where their actions don't change outcomes, specific brain regions begin to atrophy. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and self-advocacy, shows reduced activity. The hippocampus, involved in emotional regulation, actually shrinks. Meanwhile, the amygdala becomes hyperactive, more sensitive to perceived threats, more likely to trigger the stress response. The brain essentially learns, I am powerless. My needs don't matter. The best I can do is submit and hope for mercy. This is what happens when you apologize chronically for things that aren't your fault. Your brain receives the message that you are always wrong, always the problem, always the one who needs to bend, and over time you start to believe it. Not consciously, necessarily. But at a deep neurological level, your sense of self erodes. Your confidence diminishes. Your ability to advocate for yourself weakens. You become the apologizer. Not just in behavior, but in identity. The good news is that neuroplasticity works both ways. Just as your brain learned this pattern, it can learn new ones. But first, you need to understand what's reinforcing the old pattern. Every time someone accepts your unnecessary apology, your brain gets a reward. But you're not the only one getting something out of this transaction. The person receiving your apology gets something too. They get power. They get to be right. They get confirmation that you're the problem, and they're not. They get the satisfaction of watching you submit. And some people become addicted to that power just as much as they become addicted to the relief. This is why certain relationships trap you in apology cycles. You're both getting something from the dynamic. You get temporary relief from anxiety. They get ongoing confirmation of their superiority. It's a symbiotic dysfunction. And breaking it requires understanding not just your own neurological patterns, but the people who've learned to exploit them. Because the truth is, not everyone wants you to stop apologizing. Some people have built their entire relationship with you around your willingness to accept blame. Your compulsive apologizing serves their needs. Gives them someone to feel superior to, someone to blame when things go wrong. Someone who will absorb their bad moods and difficult emotions. When you start to break the apology pattern, these people will resist. They'll tell you you've changed, that you're not as nice as you used to be, that you're becoming selfish or difficult. What they really mean is, you're not performing your assigned role anymore, and they want you back in it. James discovered this when he started working on his apology addiction. His wife was relieved and supportive, but other people in his life weren't. His mother, who had spent decades positioning James as the family peacemaker and her personal emotional support system, suddenly had opinions about his therapy. She worried he was becoming cold, losing his compassionate nature, turning into someone who didn't care about family. What she actually meant was, I've lost my designated apologizer. Who's going to absorb my criticism now? Who is going to make me feel better about myself by accepting blame for things that aren't their fault? James realized that breaking his apology addiction would require more than just changing his behavior. It would require changing his relationships. And some relationships wouldn't survive that change. But that was the cost of freedom. And freedom was worth it. Not everyone accepts apologies in good faith. Some people collect them like trophies. Rebecca thought she had a difficult mother-in-law. What she actually had was someone who had identified her as an unlimited source of apologies and structured their entire relationship around extracting them. Every family gathering followed the same script. Margaret would make a pointed comment about Rebecca's parenting choices. Rebecca would apologize. Margaret would accept with exaggerated graciousness, positioning herself as the bigger person. Rebecca would leave feeling smaller. The pattern was so consistent that Rebecca started apologizing preemptively. Before Margaret could criticize her cooking, Rebecca would apologize for it not being homemade. Before Margaret could comment on the kids' behavior, Rebecca would apologize for bringing them tired. Before Margaret could find fault, Rebecca would find it first and apologize for it. Rebecca thought this strategy would prevent conflict. Instead, it gave Margaret a roadmap of vulnerabilities to exploit. Each apology taught Margaret exactly which buttons triggered the most submission. What Rebecca did understand is that Margaret represented one of 5 distinct personality types that specifically target chronic apologizers. These aren't just difficult people. They're individuals who have learned to use your apology reflex as a tool for control, status, and emotional supply. Recognizing these types is crucial because each one exploits apologies differently. And until you understand their specific tactics, you'll keep falling into the same traps. The first type is the scorekeeper. This person maintains a mental ledger of every apology they've ever received and every apology they believe they re-owed. The ledger is never balanced. You're always in debt. The scorekeeper brings up your past apologies as evidence in current conflicts. They'll reference something you apologized for months or years ago as proof that you're fundamentally flawed. They collect your apologies like ammunition, storing them for future battles. Margaret was a textbook scorekeeper. She'd mentioned that Rebecca had apologized for being late to Thanksgiving 3 years ago, using it as evidence that Rebecca didn't value family. The original apology, meant to resolve a single incident, became permanent proof of character deficiency. Scorekeepers don't accept apologies as resolution. They accept them as down payments on a debt that can never be fully repaid. Every sorry you offer increases your balance rather than reducing it. The second type is the victim professional. This person has built their identity around being wronged. They're not looking for apologies to repair relationships. They're looking for apologies to validate their victim narrative. The victim professional will accept your apology and then explain in extensive detail exactly how badly you hurt them. Your apology becomes the opening for a monologue about their suffering. They're not interested in moving forward. They're interested in establishing that you're the villain in their story. These individuals often come from genuinely difficult backgrounds. They've experienced real harm. But they've learned to extend that narrative to every interaction, positioning themselves as perpetually injured parties who deserve constant apologies and special treatment. When you apologize to a victim professional, you're not resolving a conflict. You're auditioning for the role of antagonist in their ongoing drama. The third type is the gaslighter. This person manipulates you into apologizing for their behavior. They're masters at reversing causality, making you question your own perception until you're apologizing for things they did to you. Gaslighters use a specific sequence. First, they do something harmful. Second, they deny it or minimize it. Third, they highlight your reaction to their behavior as the real problem. Fourth, they wait for you to apologize for reacting. If you try to hold them accountable, they twist the narrative until you're apologizing for being too sensitive, too demanding, too difficult. Your reasonable boundaries become unreasonable expectations. Your hurt feelings become proof that you're the problem. Margaret employed gaslighting regularly. When Rebecca mentioned feeling criticized, Margaret would express hurt that Rebecca saw her as critical. Now Rebecca was apologizing for hurting Margaret's feelings by pointing out that Margaret hurt hers. The original harm disappeared entirely, replaced by Rebecca's supposed overreaction. The fourth type is the boundary tester. This person uses your apologies as data about how far they can push. Each apology signals that a particular boundary is negotiable. They'll keep testing, keep pushing, keep waiting to see where you'll finally hold firm. Boundary testers aren't necessarily malicious. They're often people who have learned that persistence pays off. They've discovered that if they push hard enough, people will eventually apologize and give in. So they apply this strategy universally. When you apologize to a boundary tester, you're not de-escalating. You're teaching them that this boundary can be violated with enough pressure. They'll remember. They'll return. They'll push further next time. The fifth type is the emotional vampire. This person feeds on your emotional energy. Your apologies provide them with drama, attention, and the satisfaction of watching you grovel. Emotional vampires create situations specifically designed to generate apologies. They'll manufacture crises, misinterpret innocuous comments, or take offense at imagined slights. The goal isn't resolution. The goal is extracting emotional energy through the apology process. These individuals become addicted to the power dynamic where you constantly apologizing and they constantly accepting or rejecting those apologies based on whim. Your emotional state becomes their entertainment. Margaret demonstrated elements of all 5 types. She kept score of Rebecca's apologies while positioning herself as a victim of Rebecca's supposed thoughtlessness. She gaslit Rebecca into apologizing for Margaret's critical behavior. She tested every boundary Rebecca attempted to set, and she clearly derived satisfaction from watching Rebecca scramble to appease her. Rebecca had walked into a relationship with someone who had built an entire identity around extracting apologies from her. And Rebecca, trained since childhood to apologize reflexively, was the perfect target. Understanding these 5 types reveals something crucial about apology dynamics. The problem isn't just your reflex to apologize. The problem is that certain people have learned to trigger that reflex deliberately. They're not accepting your apologies because they want harmony. They're accepting them because apologies give them power, validation, entertainment, or confirmation of their worldview. Your sincere attempt at accountability becomes their tool for control. This is why apologizing to these types never resolves anything. You're not dealing with someone who wants conflict resolution. You're dealing with someone who wants conflict perpetuation, with you in the submissive role. The scorekeeper will never let you balance the ledger. The victim professional will never stop being victimized by you. The gaslighter will never acknowledge their behavior. The boundary tester will never stop testing. The emotional vampire will never be satisfied. Recognizing these patterns changes how you approach apologies with these individuals. Because once you understand that your apologies are being weaponized against you, you can start making different choices about when and how to apologize. But that requires overcoming something deeper than just habit. It requires understanding the specific ways these people have trained you to apologize. And that's where the 7 deadly apologies come in. Each one hands your power to someone else in a specific way. And recognizing them is essential to breaking free. There are 7 apologies you should never make. Each one hands your power to someone else. Sarah spent 12 years in corporate marketing before she realized what was holding her back, not her skills. Not her work ethic, not even office politics. It was the way she started every sentence. Sorry to interrupt. Sorry if this is a stupid question. Sorry for the long email. Sorry to bother you. Sorry for taking up your time. Sarah apologized an average of 23 times per workday. She'd counted during one particularly brutal week of self-awareness. 23 unnecessary apologies that positioned her as an inconvenience in her own workplace. Her male colleagues with half her experience never apologized for having ideas or asking questions or sending emails. They simply did these things as though they had every right to exist in professional spaces because they did. And so did Sarah, but only one of them knew it. The 7 deadly apologies aren't about genuine wrongdoing. They're about the ways we apologize for existing, for having needs, for taking up space in the world. And each one erodes credibility in a specific, measurable way. The first deadly apology is the preemptive strike. This is when you apologize before you've even done anything that might warrant an apology. Sorry to bother you, but could I ask a question? Sorry if this is obvious, but I'm confused about the deadline. Sorry to bring this up, but we need to discuss the budget. The preemptive apology signals that you already believe you're in the wrong for having needs, asking questions, or requiring clarity. You're apologizing for the possibility that your legitimate request might inconvenience someone. Sarah opened 90% of her work emails this way. Each one told the recipient that whatever followed was probably not important enough to warrant their time. She was priming them to dismiss her before she'd even made her point. The preemptive apology trains people to see you as uncertain and your requests as optional. When you apologize before you speak, you're giving others permission to ignore what comes next. The second deadly apology is the existence tax. This is when you apologize for occupying physical or mental space. Sorry for taking up so much room. Sorry for bothering you with my presence. Sorry for existing in a way that might be noticed. This apology is particularly common in women who've been socialized to make themselves smaller in literally every sense. Take up less space on public transportation. Speak more quietly in meetings. Apologize for bodies that are too large, too visible, too present. The existence tax apology reinforces the belief that your presence is inherently problematic, that other people are doing you a favor by tolerating your existence in shared spaces, that you owe constant apologies for the crime of being perceivable. Sarah apologized when squeezing past colleagues in hallways, when her laugh was too loud in the break room, when she needed to adjust the thermostat because she was cold. She was apologizing for having a body with needs and a personality that occasionally expressed itself. The third deadly apology is emotional contraband. This is when you apologize for having feelings. Sorry for being upset. Sorry for crying. Sorry for being angry. Sorry for caring too much. This apology suggests that your emotional responses are inappropriate, excessive, or burdensome to others. It positions normal human feelings as character flaws that require apology and correction. Emotional contraband apologies teach people that your feelings are negotiable. that you can be talked out of being hurt, that your emotional reactions are overreactions that you need to apologize for having. Sarah apologized when a colleague's comment stung. When a project she'd worked on for months was cancelled without explanation. When she felt frustrated by being interrupted for the 5th time in one meeting. She was apologizing for being human instead of being a robot that processed disappointment and disrespect without reaction. The 4th deadly apology is responsibility theft. This is when you apologize for things that are clearly someone else's fault. Sorry the restaurant lost our reservation. Sorry the weather ruined your outdoor event. Sorry your order arrived damaged. Responsibility theft apologies seem harmless. You're just being polite, smoothing over uncomfortable situations, showing empathy. But what you're actually doing is training yourself and others to see you as the universal absorber of blame. When you habitually apologize for things outside your control, you become the person everyone blames when things go wrong. Even when logic says otherwise, the pattern of you apologizing creates an association between problems and your responsibility for them. Sarah apologized when the conference room was double booked, when the printer jammed, when a vendor missed a deadline. She was collecting responsibility for system failures and other people's mistakes, building a reputation as someone who was somehow always at fault. The 5th deadly apology is the meteorological marvel. This is the most absurd category. Apologizing for weather, traffic, or other acts of nature. Sorry it's raining. Sorry about the traffic. Sorry the sun is in your eyes. This apology reveals the depth of apologetic programming. You so trained to apologize that you do it for things that are literally impossible for you to control or influence. You're apologizing to fill silence, to demonstrate deference, to perform the role of the perpetually sorry person. The meteorological apology seems trivial, but it reinforces a dangerous pattern. If you apologize for things that are obviously not your fault, people stop distinguishing between your genuine apologies and your reflexive ones. All your apologies lose meaning and credibility. The 6th deadly apology is the success penalty. This is when you apologize for doing well. Sorry for getting promoted. Sorry my project was selected. Sorry I achieved something you wanted. Sorry for being competent. The success penalty apology stems from a belief that your achievements diminish others, that your wins create losses for people around you, that you should minimize your accomplishments to avoid making others feel bad. This apology is particularly insidious because it programs you to associate success with guilt. Your brain starts to see achievement as something that requires apology and compensation. You begin self-sabotaging to avoid the discomfort of apologizing for doing well. Sarah apologized when she won a major client, when her campaign outperformed expectations, when she received recognition at company meetings. She was apologizing for being good at her job, training herself to see competence as something that required contrition. The 7th deadly apology is the boundary defense. This is when you apologize for setting limits. Sorry for saying no. Sorry I can't work late tonight. Sorry I need time to think about that. Sorry for having requirements for how I'm treated. The boundary apology undermines the very boundary you're trying to set. You're simultaneously establishing a limit and apologizing for it, which signals that the boundary is negotiable and that you feel guilty for having it. When you apologize for boundaries, you train people to push against them. The apology suggests that you don't really believe you have the right to set limits. That with enough pressure, you'll apologize more profusely and remove the boundary entirely. Sarah apologized when she couldn't take on additional projects, when she needed to leave on time to pick up her daughter, when she asked colleagues to stop interrupting her. She was apologizing for the basic act of self-preservation, teaching everyone that her boundaries were suggestions rather than requirements. These 7 apologies share a common thread. They all position you as fundamentally wrong for existing as a full person with needs, feelings, achievements, and limits. They train others to see you as an inconvenience that requires constant management and correction. Breaking free from these patterns requires recognizing them in real time and replacing them with statements that don't undermine your credibility. Instead of sorry to bother you, try thank you for your time. Instead of sorry for being upset, try I need to share how this affected me. Instead of sorry for saying no, try I'm not available for that. The resistance you'll feel to these replacements reveals how deeply the apology programming runs. Stating needs without apology feels aggressive when you've spent your life apologizing for having needs at all. But that discomfort is the price of reclaiming power you've been giving away one sorry at a time. Every unnecessary apology is a deposit into someone else's power bank. And you're going bankrupt. Marcus sat in his annual review feeling confident. He'd exceeded every performance metric, brought in 3 major clients, mentored 2 junior employees who both received promotions. His manager had praised his work repeatedly throughout the year. Then came the compensation discussion. Marcus had researched industry standards. He knew his value. He'd prepared his case for a significant raise. His manager opened with a number that was barely above cost of living adjustment. Marcus felt his stomach drop. He'd expected negotiation, but this was insulting given his performance. What happened next determined the trajectory of his next 5 years. Marcus apologized for asking about compensation, for seeming ungrateful, for not appreciating the opportunities he'd been given, for taking up time with salary discussions when his manager was clearly busy. By the end of the meeting, Marcus had talked himself out of negotiating entirely. He'd accepted the minimal raise with profuse thanks and multiple apologies for even raising the question. His colleague Jennifer had a similar conversation the same week. Similar performance, similar metrics, similar lowball offer. She didn't apologize. She presented her research, stated her requirements, and waited. She received an offer 40% higher than Marcus. The difference wasn't skill or performance. The difference was that Jennifer understood something Marcus didn't. Every apology has a price tag, and Marcus had been paying it for years. The professional cost of chronic apologizing is staggering and measurable. Studies on communication patterns in workplace negotiations show that people who apologize frequently earn an average of 18 to 23% less than colleagues with similar qualifications who apologize rarely. This isn't because apologizers are less skilled. It's because apologies signal uncertainty about your own value. When you apologize for asking for fair compensation, for taking credit for your work, or for having professional boundaries, you're telling decision makers that you don't fully believe you deserve what you're requesting, and they believe you. Your self-assessment becomes their assessment. Marcus had apologized his way through his entire career. Apologizing for speaking up in meetings meant his ideas were often credited to whoever repeated them with confidence. Apologizing for needing time off meant he was the one called during vacations and weekends. Apologizing for asking about advancement opportunities meant he was seen as grateful for whatever he was given rather than ambitious for what he deserved. Each apology seemed minor in the moment, but they compounded. After 10 years in his industry, Marcus was 2 levels below where he should have been and earning significantly less than his actual market value. The apologies had cost him approximately $300,000 in lost income and career advancement. The financial impact extends beyond salary negotiations. Chronic apologizers are less likely to ask for raises, negotiate job offers, or pursue positions they're qualified for. They're more likely to accept unfavorable contract terms, work unpaid overtime, and absorb costs that should be covered by employers. The apologetic stance becomes a financial liability that follows you throughout your career. The relational cost is equally devastating but harder to quantify. Marcus's marriage had been struggling for 3 years before he understood why. His wife had stopped viewing him as a partner. Not because she didn't love him, but because the constant apologies had shifted their dynamic from partnership to parent-child. She'd become responsible for managing his anxiety through reassurance. Every decision required Marcus apologizing preemptively in case she disapproved. Every conflict ended with Marcus apologizing regardless of what actually happened. She wasn't married to an equal. She was managing an anxious dependent who needed constant approval. The attraction and respect that had built their relationship eroded under the weight of his apologetic neediness. This pattern appears across chronic apologizer relationships. Romantic partners lose attraction because submission isn't sexually appealing. Friendships become unbalanced as apologizers position themselves as perpetually in debt. Family relationships ossify into roles where the apologizer is always wrong and others are always justified. Apologies that should repair connection actually prevent it. Because genuine intimacy requires two people who both believe they deserve to exist in the relationship without constantly atoning for that existence. Marcus's friendships had followed similar trajectories. He'd become the friend everyone vented to but no one asked about. The friend who always accommodated scheduled changes but whose own needs were treated as optional. The friend who apologized for having problems that might burden others. He wasn't in reciprocal friendships. He was performing the role of emotional support equipment for people who had learned he would absorb their difficulties without requiring support in return. The psychological cost manifests in ways that medical professionals are only beginning to fully document. Chronic apologizers show higher rates of anxiety disorders, depression, and stress-related illness. The constant state of hypervigilance, watching for signs of disapproval that might require apology, keeps the nervous system in perpetual stress response. Marcus experienced panic attacks for the first time at 37. His doctor ran tests looking for physical causes. Everything came back normal. The attacks were psychological. His body was responding to years of self-induced stress from constant apologizing and the vigilance required to know when apologies were expected. The panic attacks weren't random. They occurred before meetings where Marcus might need to assert himself, before conversations where conflict was possible, before situations where he might need to hold a boundary without apologizing. His body was responding to the perceived danger of not apologizing. Chronic apologizers also report higher rates of insomnia, digestive issues, chronic pain, and compromised immune function. The body keeps score even when the conscious mind tries to minimize the impact of constant submission. The psychological damage extends to self-concept. When you apologize constantly, you internalize the message that you are fundamentally problematic, that your thoughts, feelings, needs, and existence require constant apology and correction. This becomes your identity. Marcus had stopped trusting his own judgment. He second-guessed every decision, every opinion, every feeling. Because if he was wrong enough to require constant apologies, how could he trust anything about his own perception or experience? This erosion of self-trust creates a vicious cycle. The less you trust yourself, the more you apologize. The more you apologize, the less you trust yourself. Eventually, you become dependent on external validation for basic decisions because your internal compass has been destroyed by years of apologizing for having one. The physical cost compounds over time. Stress hormones don't just disappear after acute stress events. Chronic stress from constant apologetic vigilance creates sustained elevated cortisol levels. Over years, this contributes to cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, accelerated aging, and increased cancer risk. Marcus's blood pressure had been creeping up for 5 years. His doctor attributed it to stress and prescribed medication. But the stress wasn't from his job demands or life circumstances. It was from the exhausting work of monitoring everyone's emotional state and apologizing preemptively to prevent disapproval. He was literally damaging his health by trying to keep everyone else comfortable. The cost analysis becomes starkly clear when you calculate compounding effects: lost income, stunted career advancement, deteriorating relationships, compromised physical health, eroded psychological well-being, diminished self-concept. Each area affects the others, creating exponential damage rather than simple addition. Marcus calculated that his apologizing habit had cost him approximately $400,000 in career impact, 3 significant relationships, his physical health, and most of his self-respect. The price of trying to keep everyone comfortable had been his entire life trajectory. But the most insidious cost is opportunity. Every moment spent in apologetic submission is a moment not spent advocating for yourself, pursuing your goals, or building the life you actually want. The opportunity cost of chronic apologizing isn't just what you lose. It's what you never attempt because you're too busy apologizing for existing. Understanding these costs doesn't immediately fix the pattern, but it does something crucial. It reframes apologizing from a virtue to a liability, from humility to self-sabotage. From good manners to financial, relational, and physical self-harm. The costs are real, measurable, devastating, and completely unnecessary once you understand what real apologies are actually for. There's a difference between a real apology and a reflex apology. Most people don't know which is which. Jennifer had been close friends with Lavra for 12 years. They'd supported each other through career changes, relationship disasters, and family crises. The friendship felt unshakable until Jennifer made a mistake that nearly ended it. Lavra had confided something deeply personal about her childhood trauma. She'd asked Jennifer not to share it with anyone. Jennifer agreed. Then, during a dinner party 3 weeks later, after too much wine and too little thought, Jennifer mentioned it. Not maliciously, just carelessly. She thought the story was relevant to the conversation and forgot in the moment that it wasn't hers to share. Lavra found out the next day. She sent a brief text saying she needed space and didn't want to talk. Jennifer's first instinct was to apologize immediately. To send a long text explaining that she hadn't meant to hurt Lavra, that she'd had too much wine, that it was an accident, that she was a good friend who made a mistake. But something stopped her. She recognized this impulse. The need to apologize quickly to relieve her own discomfort, to make the bad feeling go away, to restore things to normal as fast as possible. She waited. She sat with the discomfort of having genuinely hurt someone she loved. She thought about what she'd actually done and why it mattered. She examined her own behavior without immediately jumping to self-justification or explanation. 3 days later, she reached out. Not with the reflexive apology she'd have sent on autopilot. With something different. Something real. Real apologies have 4 essential components. Missing any one of them transforms the apology from genuine accountability into manipulative performance. The first component is specific acknowledgement. This means naming exactly what you did wrong without minimizing, generalizing, or obscuring it behind vague language. Jennifer didn't say she was sorry if she'd upset Lavra or sorry that Lavra felt hurt. Those formulations dodge responsibility by focusing on the other person's reaction rather than your action. They suggest the problem is their sensitivity rather than your behavior. She acknowledged specifically that she had shared information Lavra had explicitly asked her not to share. She named the breach of trust. She identified the specific action that caused harm. No hedging, no softening, no ambiguity. Specific acknowledgement demonstrates that you understand what you actually did. That you're not apologizing generically to make peace, but taking responsibility for a particular action that had particular consequences. This is where most apologies fail. People apologize for how something was received rather than for what they did. They apologize for misunderstandings rather than for clear transgressions. They use passive voice to obscure agency. Mistakes were made rather than I made a mistake. Specific acknowledgement requires looking directly at your behavior without the protective buffer of vague language or deflection. The second component is taking full responsibility without qualification. This means no buts, no howevers. No explanations that function as excuses. Jennifer didn't tell Lavra that she'd had too much wine. She didn't mention that she forgot the conversation was confidential. She didn't explain that the story seemed relevant to the dinner discussion. All of those things might have been true, but including them in the apology would have functioned as justification. Real apologies don't explain why you did the thing that requires apology. They simply acknowledge that you did it and take responsibility for having done it. Explanations in apologies are almost always attempts to reduce your culpability or redistribute blame. This component is particularly difficult because humans are wired to defend ourselves. When confronted with our mistakes, our immediate instinct is to explain the circumstances that led to them, to show that we're not fundamentally bad people who do bad things, to contextualize our behavior. But real apologies aren't about protecting your image. They're about repairing harm you caused. And repair requires taking responsibility without asking the injured party to shoulder some of the blame by understanding your circumstances. The moment you add a but to an apology, you erase everything that came before it. What you're really saying is that you had good reasons for the harmful thing you did. That given the same circumstances, you'd likely do it again. That the other person should understand why you had no choice. Full responsibility means owning the choice you made and the consequences that followed. Not because circumstances forced you, but because you made a decision and that decision caused harm. The third component is demonstrating genuine understanding of impact. This means articulating how your action affected the other person in ways that show you've actually considered their experience rather than just your own discomfort. Jennifer didn't focus on how terrible she felt about betraying Laura's trust. Real apologies aren't about the apologizer's feelings. They are about understanding what the injured party experienced and continues to experience as a result of your actions. She articulated that Laura had trusted her with something vulnerable and that trust had been broken. That Laura now had to deal with the knowledge that her private trauma had been shared without consent. That the violation of privacy couldn't be undone. That Laura would now question what else Jennifer might share in the future. Demonstrating impact understanding requires you to step outside your own experience and genuinely consider what the other person is dealing with because of what you did. This isn't performative empathy. It's actual cognitive work to understand consequences beyond your immediate feelings. Most apologies skip this component entirely. They focus on the apologizer's remorse, regret, or intention to do better. But injured parties don't primarily need to know how you feel about what you did. They need to know that you understand how they feel about what you did to them. This distinction matters because it demonstrates whether you re-apologizing to relieve your own guilt or apologizing because you genuinely comprehend the harm you caused. The fourth component is commitment to changed behavior. This means identifying what you will do differently going forward in ways that are concrete and verifiable rather than vague promises to try harder. Jennifer didn't promise to be more careful. Careful is vague and unverifiable. Instead, she committed to not drinking alcohol at social gatherings where confidential information might come up in conversation. She committed to keeping a private document of information people had asked her not to share so she wouldn't forget the boundaries she'd agreed to. These commitments were specific, actionable, and within her control. They addressed the circumstances that led to the original breach. They demonstrated that she'd thought about how to prevent similar situations rather than just hoping it wouldn't happen again. Changed behavioral commitment is what separates genuine apologies from manipulation. Anyone can express remorse. Real accountability shows up in what you do after the apology. Whether the behavior that required apology actually changes or whether you continue the same pattern while periodically apologizing for it. This component also protects against the apology becoming a tool for enabling bad behavior. If someone apologizes repeatedly without changing the behavior they're apologizing for, the apologies are meaningless performances. Changed behavior is where apologetic words become apologetic action. Jennifer's apology included all four components. She acknowledged specifically what she'd done. She took full responsibility without explanation or justification. She demonstrated understanding of how her action affected Laura. She committed to concrete changes that would prevent similar breaches. Laura needed time to process. The apology didn't instantly restore the friendship, but it created the foundation for possible repair because it was a real apology rather than a reflexive attempt to make uncomfortable feelings disappear. 6 months later, Laura reached out. The friendship resumed cautiously. Trust rebuilt slowly. But it rebuilt because Jennifer had offered genuine accountability rather than performative remorse. This is what real apologies do. They don't erase harm. They acknowledge it fully and create conditions for potential healing. They center the injured party rather than the apologizer's need for absolution. They demonstrate through specific action that the behavior will change. Everything else is just noise designed to make the apologizer feel better while asking the injured party to minimize the harm they experienced. There are 10 situations where apologizing makes you look weak, dishonest, or manipulable. Here they are. The first situation is when you're objectively not wrong. This sounds obvious, but chronic apologizers violate this rule constantly. Someone criticizes your work that meets all specified requirements. Someone complains about the decision you made within your authority. Someone expresses disappointment about an outcome you had no control over. Apologizing when you've done nothing wrong teaches people that disapproval alone is enough to extract apologies from you. It establishes that their discomfort with the situation automatically makes you responsible for it. This is how you become the designated blame absorber for everything that goes wrong, regardless of actual causation. The alternative isn't defensive explanation. It's neutral acknowledgement. When someone expresses disappointment about something outside your control, you can acknowledge their disappointment without accepting responsibility for causing it. That's unfortunate that you're disappointed. Or I understand this isn't the outcome you wanted. No apology, no acceptance of blame. Just recognition that they're unhappy. The second situation is when someone is testing your boundaries. Boundary tests look like requests or criticisms designed to see if you defend your limits or apologize for having them. Can you work this weekend, even though you've already said you're unavailable? Why are you being so sensitive about this? Are you really going to make a big deal about something so small? When you apologize during boundary tests, you signal that your boundaries are performative rather than real. That sufficient pressure will make you abandon them while apologizing for having established them in the first place. Jennifer learned this when she stopped covering for a coworker who consistently asked her to finish his work at the last minute. The first time she declined, he suggested she wasn't being a team player. Her old pattern would have been to apologize and take on the work. Instead, she simply repeated that she wasn't available. His frustration wasn't her emergency to resolve through apology and accommodation. The third situation is when your apology would be manipulated into ammunition. Some people collect apologies as evidence of your fundamental wrongness. Apologizing to them doesn't resolve conflict. It provides documentation for future attacks. With these individuals, every apology becomes proof that you're constantly causing problems that require apology. They reference past apologies as character evidence rather than treating them as resolution of specific incidents. Apologizing to someone who weaponizes apologies this way only arms them more thoroughly. The fourth situation is when you've already apologized once for the same issue. Repeat apologies for the same incident dilute the meaning of the original apology and suggest that you not sure you were actually wrong or that you seeking absolution rather than offering accountability. If someone continues to bring up an issue after you've genuinely apologized, the problem isn't that your apology was insufficient. The problem is that they're using the incident as leverage or they're not interested in resolution. Additional apologies won't fix that. The fifth situation is when the responsibility clearly belongs to someone else. This includes apologizing for other people's mistakes, for system failures, for circumstances that have nothing to do with you. When the vendor misses a deadline and you apologize to your client as though it's your fault. When your company's policy frustrates someone and you apologize as though you created the policy. When someone else's incompetence creates problems and you apologize as though you were incompetent. These apologies train people to see you as the cause of problems rather than as someone navigating problems along with them. They also absolve the actual responsible parties of accountability by allowing them to hide behind your apologies. The sixth situation is when apologizing would undermine necessary authority. Parents apologize to children for enforcing reasonable rules. Managers apologize to employees for holding them accountable. Teachers apologize to students for maintaining standards. These apologies suggest that the authority itself is illegitimate, that the rules, accountability, or standards require apology rather than enforcement. This creates environments where the people who need structure learn that rules are negotiable through making authority figures feel guilty. Jennifer stopped apologizing to her daughter for bedtime rules after realizing it taught her daughter that parental authority was something to feel guilty about rather than something that provided necessary structure. The seventh situation is when apologizing would reward manipulation. Someone gives you the silent treatment until you apologize. Someone threatens consequences unless you apologize. Someone withholds affection, communication, or cooperation contingent on receiving an apology. Apologizing under these conditions teaches that emotional manipulation works. It establishes that creating enough discomfort will reliably produce apologies regardless of who actually caused the conflict. This guarantees the manipulation will continue and intensify. The eighth situation is when you're apologizing out of fear rather than genuine remorse. Fear of anger, fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of consequences. These apologies aren't about accountability. They're about anxiety management. Apologies motivated by fear tell the other person that scaring you is an effective tool for controlling your behavior. They incentivize threatening tactics by demonstrating that those tactics achieve their goal of making you submit through apology. The ninth situation is when apologizing would contradict your actual position. You state a boundary and then apologize for it. You make a decision and then apologize for making it. You express a need and then apologize for having it. These apologies undermine whatever you've just said or done. They signal that you don't actually believe in your own boundary, decision, or need. That you're willing to apologize for having it if that makes others more comfortable. This invites people to push against whatever you've established because your apology suggests you not fully committed to it. The 10th situation is when the other person owes you an apology. You raise a legitimate concern about their behavior and somehow end up apologizing. You identify a pattern that's harming you and you apologize for bringing it up. You set a boundary they violated and you apologize for their discomfort with the boundary. This reversal happens frequently in relationships where one person is skilled at redirecting responsibility. They respond to your concerns by making you feel guilty for having concerns. Before you realize what's happened, you're apologizing for their behavior toward you. Jennifer noticed this pattern with her mother, who responded to every attempt at addressing problematic behavior by expressing hurt that Jennifer would see her so negatively. Jennifer would end up apologizing for hurting her mother's feelings instead of addressing the original issue. The pattern continued until Jennifer recognized it and stopped participating. She learned to restate the original concern when her mother tried to reverse the dynamic. These 10 situations share a common principle. Apologizing in any of them hands power to people who will misuse it. Not because they're necessarily malicious, but because humans respond to incentives. When apologizing reliably makes you capitulate, people learn to extract apologies as a control mechanism. Refusing to apologize in these situations feels dangerous initially. You've been conditioned to believe that not apologizing makes you difficult, cold, or selfish. But that conditioning is exactly what keeps you trapped in patterns where others control you through your apologetic reflexes. The fear of not apologizing is usually worse than the actual consequences of standing firm. And recognizing these 10 situations is the first step toward breaking the pattern that's been costing you everything. You know you shouldn't apologize. But the guilt is crushing. This guilt isn't moral. It's manufactured. Understanding the difference between guilt, shame, and obligation is essential to breaking free from apologetic patterns. Most people use these terms interchangeably, but they operate through completely different psychological mechanisms and require different responses. Guilt is the feeling that you've done something wrong. It's action-focused. It evaluates behavior against your values and identifies misalignment. Healthy guilt serves a function. It prompts you to repair harm you've caused and adjust future behavior. When you've genuinely hurt someone through careless or deliberate action, guilt motivates appropriate apology and change. Shame is the feeling that you are something wrong. It's identity-focused. Shame doesn't say you made a mistake. It says you are a mistake. That something fundamental about your existence is defective or unacceptable. Shame doesn't motivate repair because it doesn't identify specific changeable behaviors. It just confirms your core unworthiness. Obligation is the feeling that you owe something based on social contracts, relationships, or conditioning. It's debt-focused. Obligation operates on ledgers of who owes what to whom. Real obligations are based on actual agreements or reasonable social expectations. False obligations are manufactured through manipulation, guilt-tripping, or exploiting your desire to be good. Chronic apologizers experience manufactured versions of all three. They feel guilty for things they didn't do wrong. They feel shame about normal human needs and boundaries. They feel obligated to people who haven't earned obligation through reciprocal care. The manufacturing process begins in childhood. Most people learn apologetic patterns from authority figures who confuse compliance with morality. Parents who demanded apologies for behaviors that weren't actually wrong. Teachers who required apologies for asking questions or needing clarification. Religious institutions that pathologized normal human desires and demanded constant repentance. These environments teach children that their default state is wrong. That simply existing with needs, feelings, and boundaries is something requiring constant apology and correction. The child learns to feel guilty for being human rather than for specific harmful actions. This conditioning operates below conscious awareness. Adults who were raised in these environments experience guilt automatically when they have needs, set boundaries, or prioritize their own well-being. They don't consciously think they're doing something wrong. They just feel the crushing sensation that tells them they should apologize. Jennifer grew up in a household where expressing negative emotions was treated as sinful. Anger, frustration, disappointment were all evidence of insufficient gratitude for blessings received. Her parents responded to emotional expression with religious lectures about thankfulness and reminders of how much worse other people had it. She learned that having feelings other than cheerful contentment was morally wrong, that expressing needs was ungrateful, that setting boundaries was selfish. By adolescence, she apologized reflexively for any emotional state that wasn't positive, any need that inconvenienced others, any boundary that made people uncomfortable. At 35, she couldn't identify whether the guilt she felt was about genuine wrongdoing or manufactured obligation. The sensation was the same regardless of whether she actually harmed someone or simply disappointed them by being unavailable. Distinguishing real from manufactured guilt requires examining the source and function. Real guilt points to specific actions that violated your values or harmed others. It has a clear cause. You lied when you value honesty. You broke a promise. You acted carelessly in ways that hurt someone. Real guilt resolves through genuine apology and changed behavior. Manufactured guilt is vague and persistent. You feel bad but can't identify what you actually did wrong. Or you can identify it but recognize rationally that it wasn't wrong, yet the guilt persists anyway. Manufactured guilt doesn't resolve through apology because it's not about actual wrongdoing. It's about control. The function test is useful here. Ask what purpose the guilt serves. Real guilt serves your integrity by alerting you to misalignment between your values and actions. Manufactured guilt serves someone else's agenda by keeping you compliant, accommodating, and apologetic. If the guilt you feel primarily benefits someone else by making you easier to control, it's manufactured. If it prompts you toward genuine accountability for harm you caused, it's real. Toxic people are expert guilt manufacturers. They've learned which buttons trigger guilt responses and they push those buttons strategically. The techniques are predictable once you recognize them. Comparison guilt positions you as selfish for having less difficult circumstances. You're tired from your job? They work 3 jobs. You're stressed about a decision? They have real problems. You need support. They have nobody to manage alone. The implication is that your needs are invalid because someone somewhere has it worse. This manufactures guilt for experiencing normal human difficulty. Historical guilt references past mistakes or times when you failed to meet their standards. You apologized years ago, but they bring it up repeatedly as evidence of your fundamental unreliability. This manufactures guilt by suggesting you can never fully atone for past imperfection. Projected guilt makes you responsible for their emotions or circumstances. They're unhappy, and it's because you're not doing enough. They're struggling, and it's because you're not supporting them adequately. This manufactures guilt by positioning their internal states as your responsibility. Obligation inflation takes reasonable requests and expands them into moral imperatives. Can you help them move becomes family helps family. Can you lend money becomes real friends don't keep score. Can you drop everything for their crisis becomes you'd do it if you really cared. This manufactures guilt by reframing your boundaries as moral failures. Religious and cultural conditioning creates particularly deep guilt patterns. Many religious traditions explicitly teach that human nature is fundamentally sinful and requires constant apology to divine authority. That framework extends into relationships where authority figures position themselves as deserving constant apology for your inadequacies. Cultural conditioning around gender roles manufactures guilt differently for men and women, but equally effectively. Women are conditioned to feel guilty for prioritizing themselves over caretaking, for having ambition, for taking up space, for saying no. Men are conditioned to feel guilty for expressing vulnerability, for having emotional needs, for not conforming to stoic provider roles. These cultural scripts operate automatically. Jennifer felt crushing guilt when she prioritized her career over her mother's expectation that she be constantly available for family obligations. She couldn't immediately identify why choosing her career felt morally wrong. The guilt was just there, heavy and insistent. Examining the source revealed it was cultural conditioning that women should prioritize relationships over professional advancement. That good daughters put family first regardless of personal goals. That her career success was somehow selfish compared to being available for her mother's emotional needs. The guilt felt real and moral. But it was manufactured by gendered expectations that she'd internalized without conscious agreement. Breaking free from manufactured guilt requires active resistance against conditioning that feels like moral truth. This resistance produces enormous discomfort because you re-fighting programming installed before you had the critical thinking skills to question it. The discomfort doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're doing something different. Your nervous system has been trained to associate not apologizing with danger. When you refuse to apologize for manufactured guilt, your body responds as though you're in actual danger. This is why logic alone doesn't fix apologetic patterns. You can rationally understand that you've done nothing wrong and still feel overwhelming guilt. The conditioning operates below the cognitive level. Rewiring requires repeatedly choosing not to apologize despite the guilt while observing that the feared consequences don't materialize. Your mother is disappointed you're unavailable. You feel guilty. You don't apologize. She adjusts or she doesn't, but you survive. The relationship doesn't end. The guilt eventually diminishes. Each repetition weakens the manufactured guilt response. Your nervous system gradually learns that not apologizing isn't actually dangerous. That disappointing people who demand constant apologies isn't a moral failure. That the guilt was a warning system calibrated for a threat that doesn't actually exist. Jennifer described it as learning to tolerate the sensation of guilt without responding to it. The guilt still appeared when she set boundaries with her mother, but she stopped treating guilt as evidence that she'd done something requiring apology. She observed the guilt, recognized it as manufactured rather than real, and acted according to her values rather than her conditioning. The guilt diminished over time, not immediately, but consistently. As her nervous system accumulated evidence that boundary setting wasn't actually dangerous, the guilt response weakened. After 2 years of consistent practice, she could set boundaries without the crushing sensation that had previously accompanied them. Breaking free from manufactured guilt is possible, but it requires understanding that the guilt itself is part of the control mechanism rather than reliable moral guidance. You've been apologizing reflexively for years. Your brain has a sorry highway. Time to build new roads. Habits exist as neural pathways carved through repetition. Every time you apologize unnecessarily, you strengthen the connection between perceived disapproval and apologetic response. The pathway becomes so established that the apology happens before conscious thought. Someone frowns and you're already saying sorry before you've processed what occurred. Breaking this pattern requires more than willpower. Willpower depletes. Neural pathways don't change through intention alone. They change through consistent alternative behavior that creates competing pathways strong enough to override the established ones. The 21-day challenge provides structure for building these competing pathways. 3 weeks isn't enough to completely rewire decades of conditioning, but it's sufficient to establish new patterns and experience their benefits, which motivates continued practice. The challenge has 3 components: awareness, replacement, and accountability. Awareness requires tracking your apologies without judgment. For the first 3 days, simply count every time you say sorry. Don't try to change the behavior yet, just notice. Most people are shocked by the number. 40 apologies in a single day is common for chronic apologizers. The counting reveals patterns. You apologize more to certain people, more in specific settings, more when tired or stressed. These patterns show where the conditioning is strongest and which situations trigger the automatic response. Jennifer tracked 73 apologies in her first day of awareness. She apologized to her coffee cup when it spilled, to her dog when it needed to go outside, to her computer when it froze, to inanimate objects and animals that couldn't possibly require apologies. The absurdity of apologizing to her laptop revealed how deeply automatic the response had become. Replacement phrases serve as competing neural pathways. Instead of sorry for being late, thank you for waiting. Instead of sorry to bother you, thank you for your time. Instead of sorry for the long email, I appreciate your patience with the details. The shift from apology to gratitude accomplishes several things simultaneously. It acknowledges the other person's accommodation without positioning yourself as fundamentally wrong. It expresses appreciation rather than submission. It maintains social grace without undermining your credibility. Other replacement patterns work for different contexts. Sorry, I'm upset becomes I need to express how this affected me. Sorry for having an opinion becomes I see it differently. Sorry for needing something becomes I need your help with this. The replacements feel unnatural initially. Your brain expects the relief that follows apology and doesn't get it from alternative phrases. This discomfort is evidence that you're building new pathways rather than traveling familiar ones. The discomfort diminishes as the new pathways strengthen. Physical techniques help interrupt the automatic pattern. The rubber band method involves wearing a rubber band around your wrist and snapping it gently every time you catch yourself about to apologize unnecessarily. The mild physical sensation interrupts the automatic response long enough to choose a different phrase. The pause technique inserts a 3-second delay between the impulse to apologize and speaking. Someone expresses disappointment. You feel the apologetic urge. Instead of immediately saying sorry, you take 3 slow breaths. Often the urge passes. When it doesn't, the pause creates space to evaluate whether apology is appropriate. Accountability partnerships provide external support for internal change. Chronic apologizers often lack accurate perception of their own patterns. A trusted person who agrees to flag unnecessary apologies helps maintain awareness when automatic responses would otherwise go unnoticed. The accountability partner's role isn't to judge or correct. It's to notice and reflect back. When you apologize unnecessarily, they simply say, "Was that apology needed?" The question prompts evaluation rather than defensive justification. Jennifer asked her sister to serve this role. Her sister started counting apologies during their weekly phone calls. The first call, Jennifer apologized 18 times in 40 minutes. Her sister noted each one without commentary. Just the awareness that someone was tracking the behavior reduced unnecessary apologies by half. During the second call, environmental modification reduces triggers that prompt automatic apologizing. If you apologize most frequently in work emails, create template language that doesn't include apologies. If you apologize most to specific people, reduce contact during the habit-breaking phase when possible. Some people trigger apologetic responses more than others. These are typically people who've trained you through years of interaction that disapproval equals required apology. Reducing exposure while building new patterns prevents overwhelm from facing your strongest triggers before you're ready. Jennifer realized her mother triggered more apologies than anyone else. During the 21-day challenge, she limited their interactions to brief text messages rather than phone calls. This wasn't permanent avoidance. It was strategic reduction of the strongest trigger while new patterns established. Progress tracking prevents the discouragement that comes from expecting immediate transformation. Breaking habits takes time and includes setbacks. Tracking shows gradual improvement even when subjective experience suggests nothing is changing. A simple spreadsheet works. Date, situation, whether you apologized, whether it was necessary, what replacement you used or could have used. Reviewing this weekly shows patterns in progress that aren't obvious day to day. Jennifer tracked 30 days. Her unnecessary apologies dropped from 73 daily to 47 by day 7, to 22 by day 14, to 9 by day 21. The progress wasn't linear. Day 16 showed a spike to 31 apologies when she was particularly stressed. But the overall trend was clear. The tracking also revealed that workplace apologies decreased faster than family apologies. Work relationships had less conditioning history and fewer emotional triggers. Family patterns established over decades required more sustained effort to change. Celebrating small wins reinforces new patterns. The brain needs positive reinforcement to maintain difficult changes. Each day you reduce unnecessary apologies deserves acknowledgement. Each conversation where you use replacement phrases successfully is evidence that change is possible. Chronic apologizers typically minimize their own progress while magnifying setbacks. This pattern undermines habit change by making the process feel futile. Deliberate celebration of incremental improvement counteracts this tendency. Jennifer marked calendar days where she went below 10 unnecessary apologies. By day 30, she had 12 marked days. Visual representation of progress motivated continued practice through difficult moments when reverting to old patterns felt easier. The goal isn't eliminating all apologies. It's developing the ability to distinguish between situations requiring genuine apology and situations requiring different responses. Over time, this discernment becomes automatic. You stop apologizing unnecessarily not because you're suppressing the urge, but because the urge no longer appears. Jennifer reached this stage after approximately 4 months of consistent practice. She could set boundaries, express needs, and handle conflict without the automatic apologetic response. When genuine apologies were needed, she offered them with confidence rather than reflexive anxiety. The change wasn't just behavioral. Her relationships improved as people responded to her increased confidence and clarity. Her career advanced as she stopped undermining her own credibility with unnecessary apologies. Her internal experience of herself shifted from perpetually wrong to reasonably competent with normal human limitations. Breaking the sorry habit transforms more than just your communication patterns. It transforms your entire relationship with yourself and your place in the world. She stopped apologizing unnecessarily. Her family called her cold. Her friends said she'd changed. This is the backlash phase. And it means it's working. The backlash isn't random resistance. It's a predictable response when you stop performing the role others have assigned you. Every relationship operates on unspoken agreements about who does what, who apologizes to whom, who accommodates whose needs. When you change your part in these agreements, everyone else must adjust their parts accordingly. Most people resist adjustment. They preferred the version of you who absorbed blame, managed their emotions through apologies, and stayed small enough not to threaten their comfort. Your transformation requires them to examine their own behavior, to take responsibility they previously offloaded onto you, to function without using your apologetic nature as their emotional regulation tool. The backlash is their attempt to restore the familiar dynamic by making you doubt your changes. The most common backlash tactic is emotional labeling. You become cold. You're not yourself anymore. You've changed, and not in a good way. These labels aren't observations. They're manipulations designed to make you feel guilty for no longer absorbing guilt you didn't deserve. Cold is particularly effective because chronic apologizers fear being perceived as unfeeling. You've built identity around being warm, accommodating, understanding. Being called cold strikes at your core self-concept. The label suggests that not apologizing unnecessarily equals not caring about people. That having boundaries equals lacking empathy. This is deliberately false. Warmth and boundaries coexist. Empathy and self-respect aren't mutually exclusive. But the backlash leverages your fear that maybe they are. That maybe refusing to apologize for your existence does make you the selfish person they're suggesting you've become. Jennifer's mother deployed this tactic immediately. The first time Jennifer declined a request without apologizing, her mother expressed concern that therapy was making Jennifer selfish, that she was losing her compassionate nature, that prioritizing her own needs meant she no longer cared about family. The timing was strategic. These concerns emerged not when Jennifer was actually being selfish, but when she first stopped being available for constant emotional labor without compensation or reciprocity. The second tactic is historical comparison. You never used to be like this. The old you would have helped. I miss who you were. This positions your previous apologetic behavior as your authentic self and your current boundaries as aberration or corruption. The implication is that chronic apologizing represented your true nature and refusing to apologize represents betrayal of that nature. But the reverse is true. The apologetic version was trained performance. The boundaried version is closer to authentic self-expression. Historical comparison leverages nostalgia. People genuinely do miss the version of you who managed their emotions, absorbed their blame, and never required them to examine their own behavior. That version was convenient. But convenience for them came at devastating cost to you. When people say they miss who you were, what they mean is they miss how easy you were to control through guilt and manufactured obligation. The third tactic is consequences threat. Explicit or implicit suggestions that your changed behavior will cost you relationships, opportunities, or social standing. If you keep this up, people will stop wanting to be around you. You're going to alienate everyone. You'll end up alone. These threats work on chronic apologizers because they've spent lives terrified of rejection and abandonment. The suggestion that not apologizing will result in abandonment confirms your deepest fear. The threat seems to validate that your apologetic behavior was necessary protection against the isolation you always dreaded, but this is manipulation through fear. The people making these threats are typically the ones who most benefited from your apologetic patterns. They re-warning you about consequences they will personally deliver if you don't revert to serving their needs through constant apology. Real relationships don't require one person to apologize their way through existence. Relationships based on your willingness to accept undeserved blame aren't relationships worth preserving. The fourth tactic is comparative ethics. Other people aren't as rigid as you're being. Normal people know how to apologize. You're taking this boundary thing too far. This positions reasonable self-respect as extremism and suggests that well-adjusted people apologize far more than you now do. Comparative ethics exploits uncertainty about whether your changes are appropriate or excessive. Chronic apologizers lack calibrated internal compasses for normal boundary setting. You've operated in chronic submission so long that reasonable self-advocacy feels aggressive. The tactic suggests that the middle ground between pathological apologizing and reasonable boundaries is more apologizing than you currently doing. That you've overcorrected. That healthy behavior lies somewhere between your old patterns and current practice. This is false. For someone recovering from chronic apologizing, what feels like reasonable boundaries is usually still somewhat excessive apologizing. Your internal calibration is skewed by years of conditioning. What feels assertive to you often registers as merely normal to others. Jennifer experienced all four tactics during her first 60 days of boundary setting. Her mother called her cold and suggested she was becoming selfish. Her friends referenced how accommodating she used to be and expressed concern about her new rigidity. Her sister warned that she was alienating family. Her coworkers suggested she was overreacting to feedback. The backlash peaked around week 6. Multiple people in different life areas simultaneously expressed concern about her changes. If she hadn't understood backlash as predictable pattern, the coordinated resistance might have convinced her that she'd genuinely become the difficult person they suggested. Instead, she recognized the pattern. These concerns emerged not randomly, but precisely when her boundaries most inconvenienced. People who relied on her boundaryless accommodating. Surviving backlash requires several strategies. First, expect it. Backlash isn't evidence you're doing something wrong. It's evidence you're disrupting patterns that benefited others at your expense. The intensity of backlash often correlates with how much someone benefited from your previous patterns. Second, maintain perspective through external support. People inside your regular relationships participated in the dynamics you're changing. They can't provide objective feedback about whether your changes are appropriate. Therapists, support groups, or friends outside the affected relationships can validate that your boundaries are reasonable. Third, evaluate criticism source and motivation. Consider who's giving feedback and what they lose when you stop apologizing unnecessarily. Criticism from people who benefited from your apologetic patterns reveals more about their needs than your behavior. Fourth, watch behavior, not words. People claim they want you to be confident and assertive until your confidence and assertiveness inconvenience them. Judge whether criticism reflects genuine concern about your well-being or frustration that you no longer easy to control. Jennifer used a simple test. Does this person reciprocate the accommodations they're criticizing me for withdrawing? Her mother demanded availability but never reciprocated. Her friends expected her to drop everything for their crises but were rarely available for hers. The co-worker who suggested she was too rigid never adjusted his own schedule to help others. The criticism came from people who took without giving. Their concerns weren't about her becoming difficult. They were about her becoming unavailable for one-sided service. The backlash phase typically lasts 6 to 12 weeks if you maintain consistency. People eventually adjust to new patterns when they realize pressure won't restore old ones. Some relationships survive the adjustment. Others reveal themselves as based entirely on your willingness to accept undeserved blame. Both outcomes serve you. Relationships that survive become more balanced and genuine. Relationships that end were keeping you trapped in dynamics that prevented growth. The loss feels painful but creates space for connections based on mutual respect rather than one-sided apologizing. Jennifer lost 3 friendships during backlash, initially devastating, eventually liberating. The friendships had required constant emotional labor without reciprocity. Ending them freed energy for relationships where care flowed bidirectionally. The backlash isn't failure. It's confirmation that you're changing patterns significant enough to notice. And that's exactly what transformation requires. Some people apologize as an attack. These aren't apologies, they're declarations of war. The weaponized apology looks like accountability but functions as aggression. It uses apologetic language to avoid genuine responsibility while making you feel guilty, crazy, or unreasonable. Recognizing these false apologies is essential because accepting them as real apologies trains you to accept mistreatment while believing conflict has been resolved. The most common weaponized apology is the feeling deflection. I'm sorry you feel that way. This appears to acknowledge your distress but actually dismisses it. The apology isn't for the action that caused your feelings. It's for your inconvenient emotional response. The implication is that the problem isn't what happened, but your excessive sensitivity to what happened. This formulation shifts focus from their behavior to your reaction. It positions your hurt as the issue requiring apology rather than their action that caused hurt. You end up defending your right to have feelings instead of discussing the behavior that prompted those feelings. Jennifer's colleague used this tactic consistently. After making cutting remarks in meetings, he'd offer the feeling deflection. I'm sorry you felt attacked by my feedback. The apology acknowledged that she felt attacked while denying that he'd actually attacked. Her feelings became the problem. His behavior disappeared from discussion. The second weaponized apology is the conditional absolution. I'm sorry if I offended you. The if suggests that offense is questionable. That maybe you weren't actually offended or maybe your offense was unjustified. The apology apologizes for the possibility of offense while maintaining that offense might not have been warranted. This construction provides plausible deniability. The person can claim they apologized while simultaneously suggesting nothing actually wrong occurred. They're covering themselves socially without admitting wrongdoing. The conditional also places burden of proof on you. If you accept the apology, you're accepting the if, which means accepting that maybe you misinterpreted or overreacted. If you reject the apology, you appear unreasonable since they technically apologized. The third weaponized apology is the character assassination disguised as contrition. I'm sorry I'm such a terrible person. I'm sorry I always mess everything up. I'm sorry I'm so worthless. This isn't genuine remorse. It's manipulation through exaggerated self-flagellation. The performance forces you into the position of comforting them and minimizing the very behavior you were trying to address. You came to discuss their specific action. Now you're managing their emotional crisis and reassuring them they're not fundamentally terrible. The tactic works because declining to comfort someone in apparent distress feels cruel. But the distress is performance designed to redirect attention from their behavior to their feelings about being confronted. You end up apologizing to them for making them feel bad about the thing they did that made you feel bad. Jennifer's ex-partner deployed this tactic expertly. Every attempt to discuss his behavior resulted in elaborate self-condemnation that required her to spend hours reassuring him. The original issue never got addressed because all energy went to managing his theatrical remorse. The fourth weaponized apology is the responsibility redistribution. I'm sorry I didn't realize you were so sensitive about this. I'm sorry my joke upset you when you usually have a better sense of humor. I'm sorry I didn't know you couldn't handle direct communication. These apologies include implicit criticism of you within the apologetic structure. They're apologizing while simultaneously suggesting that your reaction is the problem. That a reasonable person wouldn't have responded the way you did. That their behavior was fine and your sensitivity is the issue. This tactic is particularly effective because it sounds like they're taking responsibility. They're apologizing for not anticipating your unique fragility. But what they're actually doing is pathologizing your normal response to their abnormal behavior. The fifth weaponized apology is the historic precedent dismissal. I already apologized for that. Why do you keep bringing up things I apologized for? This positions your continued distress or discussion of the issue as unfair persecution of someone who already took accountability. But apologies don't erase consequences or prevent discussion of patterns. A genuine apology for a specific incident doesn't mean that incident can never be referenced again, especially if it's part of a larger pattern or if the apologized behavior continues. This tactic tries to use a previous apology as a shield against accountability for ongoing or related behavior. It suggests that one apology should purchase immunity from future discussion of that behavior or similar behaviors. The sixth weaponized apology is the audience manipulation. Public apologies designed to make you look unreasonable if you don't immediately accept them. I'm sorry in front of mutual friends, family, or colleagues delivered with visible emotion and apparent sincerity. The public setting pressures you to accept regardless of whether the apology is genuine. Rejecting it makes you appear petty or unforgiving in front of witnesses. The apologizer knows this and uses the audience as leverage to force acceptance of an apology that might not meet the requirements of genuine accountability. These public apologies often lack the components of real apologies. They don't specify what was wrong, don't demonstrate understanding of impact, and don't commit to changed behavior. They're performances of contrition designed to manipulate social opinion rather than repair actual harm. The seventh weaponized apology is the preemptive strike. Apologizing for things before you can bring them up, but doing so in ways that minimize the behavior and forestall deeper discussion. I know I've been distant lately, sorry about that. Deployed quickly before you can articulate the specific pattern of withdrawal and its impact. This tactic acknowledges the surface issue while avoiding deeper accountability. It beats you to the conversation and frames it in the most minimal terms possible. You're left either accepting the superficial apology or appearing to reject their attempt at accountability, which makes you seem unreasonable. Responding to weaponized apologies requires refusing to accept the frame they establish. You don't accept the feeling deflection as a real apology. You address the behavior directly. Your comment in the meeting was inappropriate regardless of how I felt about it. What you said was the issue, not my reaction to it. You don't get pulled into the character assassination drama. You refuse to comfort them for feeling bad about behavior you're trying to address. I'm not discussing whether you're a terrible person. I'm discussing this specific thing that happened and needs to change. You don't accept conditional apologies as real. If isn't necessary. You offended me. What you said was offensive. If you're genuinely sorry, say so directly without the conditional qualifier. You don't let previous apologies prevent discussion of current behavior. Apologizing once doesn't create immunity. This pattern continues regardless of past apologies, which suggests the apologies weren't accompanied by genuine changed behavior. Jennifer learned to identify weaponized apologies through pattern recognition. Real apologies felt resolving. Weaponized apologies felt like openings to new conflicts where she ended up defending herself or comforting them. Real apologies acknowledged specific behavior. Weaponized apologies deflected to her feelings, sensitivity, or unreasonableness. Once she stopped accepting false apologies as real, the people deploying them had two choices: offer genuine accountability or reveal their unwillingness to do so. Both outcomes served her. Real apologies led to improved relationships. Revealed unwillingness to genuinely apologize provided clarity about who these people actually were. Weaponized apologies exploit your desire for conflict resolution and harmony. They offer the appearance of accountability while avoiding its substance. Learning to recognize and reject them is essential to breaking free from dynamics where your legitimate concerns get transformed into your supposed oversensitivity. Real apologies repair. Weaponized apologies entrench the very patterns they pretend to address. And accepting weaponized apologies as real guarantees the behavior they pretend to apologize for will continue unchanged. Real apologies are powerful, but they only work when three conditions are met. Miss one, and you're wasting your breath. Understanding when genuine apology is appropriate prevents two equally destructive patterns. Over-apologizing destroys credibility and self-respect. Under-apologizing damages relationships and prevents growth. The skill isn't eliminating apologies. It's calibrating them precisely to situations where they serve genuine repair rather than reflexive submission. The first condition is actual wrongdoing. You must have done something that violated reasonable expectations, caused preventable harm, or broke explicit or implicit agreements. This seems obvious, but chronic apologizers blur the line between wrongdoing and merely disappointing someone or making choices others disagree with. Wrongdoing means you failed to meet standards you agreed to meet. You promised to complete work by a deadline and didn't. You committed to keeping information confidential and shared it. You agreed to be somewhere and forgot. These are failures to uphold your stated commitments. Wrongdoing also includes causing preventable harm through carelessness or deliberate action. You spoke carelessly and hurt someone's feelings. You made a decision without considering its impact on others who deserved consideration. You acted in ways that damaged trust or safety. What wrongdoing doesn't include is making decisions others dislike, having boundaries they find inconvenient, or prioritizing your needs over their preferences. Disappointing someone isn't wrongdoing. Failing to meet unreasonable expectations isn't wrongdoing. Declining requests isn't wrongdoing. Jennifer struggled with this distinction. Her mother considered Jennifer's unavailability for daily phone calls to be wrongdoing that required apology, but Jennifer had never agreed to daily availability. Her mother's expectation was unilateral, not mutual. Failing to meet unilateral expectations doesn't constitute wrongdoing. Real wrongdoing has clear causation between your action and negative outcome. You did something, harm resulted. The connection is direct and you reasonably could have prevented it. The second condition is genuine understanding of impact. You must comprehend not just what you did but how it affected the other person in ways that matter to them, not just ways you imagine it affected them. This requires moving past your own discomfort about having caused harm. Apologizing to relieve your guilt isn't genuine apology. It's using apology as anxiety management. Real apology centers the injured party's experience. Understanding impact means asking how the action affected them and listening without defending or explaining. It means resisting the urge to minimize their experience or compare it to worse things that could have happened. It means acknowledging that impact matters regardless of your intention. Jennifer damaged a friendship by forgetting her friend's birthday for the second consecutive year. Her first instinct was to apologize for being forgetful. But forgetfulness wasn't the impact. The impact was her friend feeling unimportant and questioning whether Jennifer valued their friendship. Understanding that distinction changed the apology. Instead of apologizing for poor memory, she apologized for making her friend feel devalued and for creating reasonable doubt about Jennifer's investment in the relationship. The apology addressed actual impact rather than just explaining the cause. This level of understanding usually requires direct conversation, not assumptions about how someone feels, not projections of how you would feel. Actual listening to their specific experience of your action. The understanding also requires accepting that your good intentions don't erase impact. You didn't mean to hurt them. You were trying to help. You thought they'd appreciate it. These explanations are irrelevant to impact. What matters is what actually occurred, not what you hoped would occur. The third condition is ability and willingness to change behavior. Apologizing for something you'll continue doing isn't genuine apology. It's advanced permission seeking for future violations. Changed behavior doesn't mean perfection. It means demonstrating through action that you've adjusted patterns to prevent recurrence of the specific harm you caused. If you apologize for chronic lateness, you implement systems to arrive on time. If you apologize for breaking confidence, you establish protocols to prevent future breaches. The behavior change must address root causes, not just symptoms. Jennifer had apologized multiple times for forgetting plans with a friend. But the apologies were meaningless because she continued using the same unreliable memory system. Genuine changed behavior meant implementing calendar reminders and confirmation protocols, not just feeling bad about forgetting. Some situations allow for changed behavior. Others don't because the harm is irreversible or the behavior is part of unchangeable circumstances. In these cases, genuine apology acknowledges the harm while being honest about inability to prevent similar situations. I caused harm. I understand the impact. I cannot guarantee this won't happen again given current constraints. This honesty allows the injured party to make informed decisions about the relationship given realistic rather than promised futures. It's more respectful than apologizing while pretending you can change things you can't. These three conditions work together. All three must be present for genuine apology. Apologizing when you haven't actually done something wrong teaches others that your apologies are meaningless capitulations. Apologizing without understanding impact makes the apology about relieving your guilt, rather than addressing their harm. Apologizing without changed behavior reduces apology to empty ritual that predicts nothing about future behavior. Jennifer used this framework when a client complained about communication delays during a project. She evaluated the three conditions. First, had she done something wrong? Yes. She'd committed to weekly updates and provided only 2 updates over 6 weeks. This violated explicit agreement. Second, did she understand impact? She asked. The client explained that the silence created anxiety about project status and made them question whether to continue the engagement. The delay wasn't just annoying. It undermined trust in professional relationship. Understanding this mattered more than understanding they were annoyed. Third, could she change behavior? Yes, she implemented automated weekly status emails and calendar reminders. She adjusted her project management system to prevent similar failures. All three conditions met, she offered genuine apology that addressed specific wrongdoing, demonstrated understanding of actual impact, and committed to concrete changed behavior. The relationship repaired because the apology was real rather than performative. Timing matters for genuine apologies. Immediate apologies often come from anxiety rather than genuine understanding. The discomfort of having caused harm makes you rush to apologize before you've fully grasped what occurred. These premature apologies miss crucial information and often require second apologies once you understand what actually happened. Delayed apologies allow for reflection. What did I actually do? How did it affect them? What needs to change? This reflection produces apologies with substance, rather than apologies designed to quickly restore comfort. But delayed doesn't mean indefinite. Apologizing years after harm, without prompting, often serves the apologizer's need for closure, rather than the injured party's needs. They've moved on. Reopening old wounds to relieve your guilt isn't genuine apology. It's using them for your emotional resolution. The appropriate timing window depends on context. Professional situations often need faster apologies to maintain working relationships. Personal relationships allow more time for genuine understanding to develop. The key is apologizing when you genuinely meet all three conditions, not before and not so long after that reopening the issue serves only you. Cultural context affects apology norms. Some cultures emphasize indirect apologies and face saving. Others value direct accountability. Professional environments have different standards than personal relationships. Understanding these contexts prevents both over and under apologizing relative to situation expectations. But regardless of cultural or contextual variations, the three conditions remain essential. Genuine wrongdoing, real understanding of impact, and committed behavior change distinguish real apologies from reflexive submissions or manipulative performances. Mastering when to apologize transforms apologies from weakness into strength. Real apologies become rare, powerful, and genuinely repairing rather than common, meaningless, and destructive. We're raising a generation of automatic apologizers. Every forced say sorry to your kid is programming them for people-pleasing. The standard parenting script goes like this. Child hits sibling. Parent demands immediate apology. Child refuses. Parent escalates. You need to say sorry right now. Child mumbles sorry under duress. Parent considers the issue resolved. This ritual happens thousands of times throughout childhood and teaches nothing about genuine remorse, while teaching everything about compliance through forced apology. The child learns that apologies are performances demanded by authority figures to end uncomfortable situations. That sorry is a magic word that makes consequences disappear. That expressing remorse is about satisfying others rather than genuine accountability. These lessons create adults who apologize reflexively to authority, while never developing actual capacity for taking responsibility. Worse, the child learns that feelings don't matter. They're not sorry. They're angry their sibling provoked them. But their authentic feelings are irrelevant. The only acceptable response is the apologetic performance regardless of actual internal state. This disconnect between authentic feeling and required expression trains emotional dishonesty. Jennifer watched her daughter automatically apologize after any conflict with peers. The apologies were immediate, reflexive, and rarely connected to actual wrongdoing. Her daughter apologized when other children took her toys, when she was excluded from games, when she expressed preferences that differed from the group. She was 6 years old and already apologizing for existing. Jennifer recognized the pattern because she'd lived it. She taught her daughter these responses through years of demanding apologies without examining whether apologies were appropriate. Say sorry to your brother. Say sorry for making noise. Say sorry for needing attention. The child absorbed the lesson that her presence required constant apology. Breaking this cycle required fundamentally different approach to teaching accountability. Instead of demanding apologies, Jennifer started asking questions that helped her daughter examine her own actions and their effects. After her daughter grabbed a toy from another child, Jennifer didn't demand apology. She asked what happened from her daughter's perspective, then asked how the other child might have experienced it, then asked what could be done to repair the situation. This process took longer than demanding sorry, but taught actual thinking about accountability rather than performance of remorse. Age-appropriate apology education differs dramatically from forced apologies. Young children lack the cognitive development to genuinely understand impact of their actions on others. They're egocentric not from selfishness but from developmental stage. Forcing apologies before they can comprehend genuine accountability teaches only that adults require certain words in certain situations. For children under 5, restitution teaches more than apology. If they break something, they help fix it. If they hurt someone, they bring ice or bandages. These concrete actions teach that harm requires repair in ways abstract apologies don't. The actions also teach that mistakes can be addressed through problem solving rather than just verbal performance. Between 5 and 8, children develop capacity to understand that others have different perspectives. This is when teaching genuine apology becomes possible. But it still requires guidance rather than demands. Asking how they think the other person feels. Asking what they could do to make the situation better. Asking if they understand why their action caused upset. These questions scaffold the thinking that underlies genuine apology. Eventually, the child internalizes this process and can generate it independently. But rushing to demand sorry before these cognitive skills develop just trains compliance. After age 8, children can engage in genuine apologetic thinking. They can identify their action, understand impact, and commit to different behavior. At this stage, modeling becomes crucial. Children learn apology patterns primarily from watching how adults apologize. If parents apologize genuinely for actual wrongdoing and never apologize for reasonable boundaries, children learn the distinction. If parents apologize constantly for their own existence, children mirror that pattern. Gender differences in apology training require attention. Girls receive significantly more pressure to apologize than boys. Studies show parents accept defiance from boys while demanding immediate compliance from girls. Teachers tolerate more boundary pushing from male students while requiring female students to be perpetually accommodating. This differential training creates adult women who apologize reflexively and adult men who rarely apologize, even when genuine accountability would serve them. Both patterns are damaging. The solution isn't teaching boys to apologize as reflexively as girls currently do. It's teaching all children to apologize genuinely and rarely rather than reflexively and constantly. Jennifer noticed she demanded more apologies from her daughter than her son. She accepted her son's assertion that his sister had provoked him while requiring her daughter to apologize for responding to provocation. She expected her daughter to manage her son's feelings through apology, while never expecting her son to manage his sister's feelings. This asymmetry taught her daughter that her needs mattered less than her brother's comfort, that she was responsible for everyone's emotional state, that boundaries were less legitimate for her than for him. Recognizing this pattern allowed Jennifer to adjust expectations to be genuinely equal rather than superficially fair. Teaching children about boundaries and apologies happens simultaneously. Children need to learn that having boundaries doesn't require apologizing for having them. That saying no is a complete sentence. That their needs and preferences deserve respect equal to others' needs and preferences. This means not requiring children to hug relatives they don't want to hug. Not forcing them to share every possession. Not demanding they accept treatment that makes them uncomfortable just because adults consider it harmless. Children who learn their boundaries don't matter learn to apologize for having boundaries as adults. It also means teaching children to respect others' boundaries without requiring apology for the boundary existing. When another child says no to sharing, the appropriate response isn't demanding apology for selfishness. It's accepting the boundary. This teaches that boundaries are legitimate rather than offenses requiring apology. Jennifer stopped forcing her daughter to hug grandparents who made her uncomfortable. The grandparents complained. Suggested Jennifer was raising a rude child. Jennifer explained that her daughter's bodily autonomy mattered more than adult feelings about hugs. That teaching her daughter to override her own discomfort to please adults was teaching her to accept boundary violations. The grandparents adjusted. Her daughter learned that her no was respected, and she learned not to apologize for protecting herself. Breaking generational patterns requires parents to address their own apologetic programming while teaching children differently. Jennifer couldn't teach her daughter to avoid chronic apologizing while modeling chronic apologizing. Her daughter was learning primarily through observation, not instruction. This meant Jennifer had to change her own patterns visibly. Stop apologizing to her children for enforcing reasonable rules. Stop apologizing to her partner for having needs. Stop apologizing to service workers for making reasonable requests. Her daughter needed to see that adults can exist without constant apology. The modeling included apologizing genuinely when appropriate. When Jennifer lost her temper unfairly with her daughter, she offered real apology, acknowledged her specific behavior, explained the impact, committed to better emotional regulation. This taught what genuine accountability looked like. The combination of rare genuine apologies and complete elimination of reflexive apologies taught her daughter the distinction between real accountability and performative submission. The most difficult part of teaching children about apologies is resisting social pressure from other adults. Schools, relatives, and other parents expect children to apologize immediately for any perceived transgression. Standing firm against these expectations feels like bad parenting because it violates dominant cultural scripts about childhood behavior. Jennifer faced criticism from teachers who expected her daughter to apologize reflexively when any conflict occurred. She had to explain repeatedly that her daughter was being taught to take genuine accountability rather than perform apologies. That this teaching took longer but produced better long-term outcomes. Some teachers understood. Others viewed her as difficult parent raising difficult child. The criticism was worth it. Her daughter developed capacity to distinguish between genuine wrongdoing requiring apology and situations requiring boundary setting without apology. At 12, she could apologize genuinely when appropriate and stand firm when apology would undermine legitimate boundaries. This capacity would serve her throughout life. Teaching children about apologies shapes the adults they become. Children forced to apologize constantly become adults who apologize reflexively. Children taught genuine accountability become adults who apologize meaningfully and rarely. The choice parents make determines whether the next generation continues apologetic programming or breaks free. She doesn't apologize unless she means it. People respect her more, not less. This is what confidence actually looks like. The transformation from chronic apologizer to confident communicator isn't about becoming rigid or cold. It's about developing discernment that allows you to apologize powerfully when appropriate while standing firm when apology would undermine legitimate boundaries. This calibration separates genuine confidence from both excessive apologizing and defensive refusal to ever admit wrongdoing. Confidence and arrogance are frequently confused. Chronic apologizers fear that not apologizing reflexively will make them arrogant. But the distinction is clear. Arrogance denies genuine wrongdoing and refuses accountability. Confidence acknowledges actual mistakes while refusing to apologize for existence, boundaries, or reasonable choices. Arrogant people never apologize because they believe they're never wrong. Confident people rarely apologize because they accurately distinguish between actual wrongdoing and situations that don't require apology. When genuine wrongdoing occurs, confident people apologize clearly and directly, without the excessive self-flagellation that characterizes chronic apologizers. Jennifer reached this distinction after 18 months of conscious practice. She could now walk into meetings without prefacing contributions with apology. She could decline requests without apologizing for unavailability. She could express needs without apologizing for having them. And when she genuinely made mistakes, she apologized with clarity that her previous excessive apologies never achieved. The respect paradox reveals itself once you stop apologizing unnecessarily. Chronic apologizers believe constant apologizing demonstrates humility that earns respect. The opposite occurs. Excessive apologizing signals uncertainty, weakness, and lack of self-respect. Others unconsciously mirror your self-assessment. If you position yourself as perpetually wrong, they believe you. When you apologize rarely and meaningfully, apologies carry weight. People take them seriously because they know you don't apologize reflexively. Your genuine accountability stands out against the backdrop of appropriate self-assuredness. This combination commands respect in ways chronic apologizing never achieved. Jennifer experienced this shift dramatically at work. For years, she'd apologized her way through every interaction while being passed over for advancement. After breaking her apologizing patterns, she received a promotion within 6 months. Her manager explained that she now demonstrated the executive presence they'd been waiting to see. Her actual competence hadn't changed. Her communication patterns had, and those patterns shifted how others perceived her capabilities. The respect increase wasn't limited to professional contexts. Her romantic relationship improved as her partner responded to her increased self-assurance. Her friendships became more balanced as friends adjusted to reciprocal rather than one-sided dynamics. Even strangers treated her differently. Service workers took her concerns seriously. Salespeople didn't push as aggressively. Social interactions felt easier because she no longer radiated the apologetic energy that invited dismissal. Reading social situations becomes crucial for confident non-apologizers. Some contexts require different calibration than others. Professional environments often demand more formal accountability than personal relationships. Cultural contexts create varying expectations around apology frequency and directness. Confident communication means adjusting appropriately to context without abandoning core principles. This isn't about reverting to reflexive apologizing in certain situations. It's about understanding that genuine accountability looks different across contexts. In some professional settings, acknowledging mistakes quickly maintains team efficiency, even when extensive apology isn't required. In certain cultures, indirect expressions of accountability preserve face while still addressing wrongdoing. Jennifer learned this through international business experience. In direct communication cultures, her straightforward accountability without excessive apology worked well. In cultures valuing indirect communication and face saving, she learned to express genuine accountability through different linguistic structures while still maintaining her core principle of apologizing only for actual wrongdoing. The calibration means adjusting expression of accountability to cultural and contextual norms without apologizing for boundaries, needs, or existence regardless of context. The substance remains consistent, the style adjusts appropriately. Authentic communication differs from strategic communication. Strategy implies manipulation. Authenticity implies genuine self-expression. Confident non-apologizers aren't strategically withholding apologies to gain advantage. They're authentically expressing appropriate accountability while refusing to apologize for things that don't require apology. This distinction matters because people sense manipulation. If you're calculating apologetic responses to maximize personal benefit, that inauthenticity shows. If you're genuinely expressing accountability when appropriate and standing firm when it's not, that authenticity builds trust. Jennifer noticed this difference in how people responded to her. When she was strategically trying not to apologize to appear more confident, people sensed the performance. When she genuinely felt no need to apologize because she'd done nothing wrong, her confidence was natural and compelling. The shift from performance to authentic self-expression made all the difference. The integration phase brings together old wisdom and new boundaries. You don't lose your capacity for empathy, kindness, or consideration. You retain those qualities while adding self-respect and appropriate self-advocacy. The combination creates fuller presence than either chronic apologizing or defensive rigidity provides. Jennifer remained compassionate and considerate. She still cared about others' feelings and needs, but she stopped managing others' emotions through her own self-diminishment. She could be kind without being a doormat, empathetic without being a repository for everyone's problems, present without being perpetually available. This integration meant sometimes disappointing people without apologizing for the disappointment, saying no to requests without apologizing for being unavailable, setting boundaries that created inconvenience for others without apologizing for their inconvenience. The confidence to prioritize appropriately rather than constantly sacrificing her needs to preserve others' comfort. The integration also meant recognizing that her previous excessive apologizing hadn't actually been kindness. It had been people-pleasing that prevented genuine connection by maintaining her in submissive role. Real kindness required being a whole person with legitimate needs and boundaries rather than emotional support equipment for everyone around her. Maintaining confidence without apology requires ongoing practice. Old patterns reassert during stress, fatigue, or when facing particularly aggressive boundary pushes. The neural pathways carved through years of chronic apologizing don't disappear completely. They just become less dominant as new patterns strengthen. Jennifer noticed apologetic tendencies resurface when she was exhausted or anxious. The old programming reasserted when defenses were down. Recognizing this pattern allowed her to forgive temporary backslides while recommitting to confident communication once she'd recovered from whatever had triggered regression. The practice also required vigilance against overcorrection. Some recovering chronic apologizers swing to defensive refusal to ever apologize. This rigidity is reaction formation rather than genuine confidence. True confidence includes capacity to acknowledge genuine mistakes without either excessive self-flagellation or defensive denial. Finding this balance takes time. Jennifer spent several months being too rigid before finding the appropriate middle ground. She had to learn that breaking free from chronic apologizing didn't mean never admitting wrongdoing. It meant developing accurate calibration for when apology served genuine accountability versus when it served reflexive submission. The confident non-apologizer becomes someone others actually want to be around. Chronic apologizers exhaust people by requiring constant reassurance and emotional management. Defensive non-apologizers frustrate people by refusing accountability. Confident non-apologizers engage authentically, take responsibility genuinely, and maintain appropriate boundaries consistently. This presence attracts healthier relationships. People who needed you to be chronically apologetic filter themselves out. People who appreciate authentic engagement and mutual respect gravitate toward you. The quality of your relationships improves as you become someone who can be both vulnerable and boundaried, both accountable and self-respecting. Jennifer found that her social circle naturally shifted as her communication patterns changed. Friends who'd relied on her excessive apologizing and one-sided emotional labor gradually drifted away. New friendships formed with people who valued reciprocity and genuine connection. The transition felt lonely initially. Eventually, it felt liberating. The confident non-apologizer isn't an end state. It's ongoing practice of authentic communication that balances accountability with self-respect. It's the middle path between reflexive submission and defensive rigidity, and it's available to anyone willing to do the uncomfortable work of breaking patterns that no longer serve them. Remember that person who apologized for breathing? Who said sorry before asking questions? Who carried everyone else's guilt? That person is gone. This is who you are now. Michelle walked into her second interview with the same company that had rejected her 18 months earlier. Different position, different panel. But she remembered every excruciating moment of that first interview where she de-apologized 17 times and talked herself out of a job she was qualified for. This time felt different from the moment she entered the room. Her posture was open but grounded. Her handshake was firm. When the interviewer asked about the gap in her employment, she explained it directly without apologizing for the circumstances. When asked about a mistake at her previous job, she described what happened, what she learned, and how she'd applied that learning without excessive self-flagellation or defensive minimizing. Halfway through the interview, one panelist spilled coffee on the table. Michelle's old instinct was to apologize. Instead, she simply moved her papers out of the way and continued her answer while the person cleaned up. No apology for something that wasn't her fault. No apology for existing in the space where someone else made a minor mistake. She left that interview feeling like herself, not performing confidence, not strategically withholding apologies, just being a competent professional who took genuine accountability without accepting undeserved blame. She got the job. The position she'd been rejected for 18 months ago. And this time the feedback was that she demonstrated exactly the kind of presence and clarity they needed at that level. Identity transformation happens gradually through accumulated small choices that eventually create new default patterns. You don't wake up one morning suddenly freed from apologetic programming. You make hundreds of micro decisions to speak without apologizing, set boundaries without apologizing, exist without apologizing. Eventually, those micro decisions become automatic. The transformation markers are subtle but significant. You notice you haven't apologized in days. You realize you handled conflict without reflexive capitulation. You observe that people treat you differently even though you haven't explicitly discussed your changes with them. They're responding to energy shift rather than verbal announcement. Jennifer tracked these markers as evidence of genuine transformation rather than temporary behavior modification. She went full weeks without unnecessary apologies. Colleagues started consulting her opinion more frequently. Her partner stopped treating her like emotional dependent. Her children observed her modeling appropriate boundaries without guilt. The markers weren't just about apology reduction. They included increased capacity to receive compliments without deflection, to accept help without excessive gratitude, to disagree without anxiety, to prioritize her needs without shame. The apologetic stance had been symptom of deeper pattern where she positioned herself as fundamentally less important than everyone around her. That foundational belief had shifted. Relationship quality transformed across every domain. Professional relationships became more balanced as Michelle stopped positioning herself as perpetually grateful for opportunities she'd earned. Her colleagues treated her as peer rather than supplicant because she stopped communicating like someone seeking permission to exist in professional spaces. Romantic relationships improved when she brought whole self rather than accommodating fragment. Her current partner had never known the apologetic version. He'd met her after transformation. She occasionally wondered if previous relationships would have survived if she'd had these skills earlier. Probably not. Those relationships had required her submission to function. They would have resisted her transformation exactly as relationships in her life had resisted when she first began changing. Friendships deepened with people who valued reciprocity and became superficial, or ended with people who needed her to be endlessly available without reciprocation. The friendship pruning had been painful but necessary. She now had a smaller circle of genuine connections rather than large network of one-sided relationships. Family relationships remain most complicated. Decades of established patterns don't transform overnight. Her mother still occasionally tested old boundaries. Her siblings still sometimes expected her to absorb family emotional labor, but she maintained new patterns consistently. Over time, family adjusted or learned to work around her boundaries. The adjustment wasn't complete, but it was sufficient. Self-respect restoration happens as consequence of behavioral change rather than as prerequisite. Chronic apologizers often believe they need to feel more self-respect before they can stop apologizing. The causation runs opposite direction. You build self-respect through repeated acts of self-advocacy and boundary maintenance. The feeling follows the behavior. Jennifer noticed this backwards pattern in her own healing. She'd spent years trying to build self-esteem through positive self-talk and affirmations. Nothing changed because she continued behaving in ways that undermined whatever self-respect she tried to build. Affirmations about worthiness meant nothing when she apologized for existing all day long. When she changed behavior first, feelings eventually followed. Each time she set boundary without apologizing, she accumulated evidence that her needs mattered. Each time she expressed opinion without prefacing with apology, she demonstrated to herself that her thoughts deserve space. The accumulated evidence of changed behavior eventually shifted her internal sense of self. This is why behavior change precedes identity change. You can't think your way into new identity. You have to act your way into it. The person who stops apologizing unnecessarily eventually becomes someone who doesn't need to apologize unnecessarily because their entire relationship with themselves and others has transformed. The apology audit reveals the distance traveled. Comparing old patterns to current ones makes transformation visible in ways that feel invisible during gradual change. Jennifer reviewed her old journals where she'd tracked 73 apologies in a single day. Her current average was under 3, all for actual wrongdoing requiring genuine accountability. The audit also showed changed language patterns. Her emails no longer opened with apologies for sending emails. Her requests no longer included apologies for making requests. Her boundaries no longer came wrapped in apologetic justifications. The communication shift wasn't just about removing sorries. It was about fundamentally different relationship with her right to communicate needs, thoughts, and boundaries. Michelle conducted similar audit before her successful interview. She reviewed notes from previous interview where she'd chronicled every apology. Seeing them compiled revealed the extent of self-sabotage she'd engaged in. The contrast with her preparation for second interview showed genuine transformation. She'd practiced expressing competence without undermining it through apology. The practice had worked. Your new communication style is characterized by clarity, directness, and appropriate accountability. You state needs without apologizing for having them. You express opinions without apologizing for holding them. You set boundaries without apologizing for establishing them. And when you genuinely make mistakes, you apologize clearly and directly without the excessive remorse that dilutes genuine accountability. This style feels aggressive to people who preferred you apologetic. It feels normal to people who never expected constant apologies. It feels liberating to you because you're finally communicating authentically rather than through filter of chronic submission. The style also includes comfort with disappointing people when necessary. Chronic apologizers exhaust themselves trying to prevent anyone from ever being disappointed. Confident communicators recognize that disappointment is a normal part of relationships where two people have different needs and preferences. You can acknowledge someone's disappointment without accepting responsibility for causing it or apologizing for making choices that serve your legitimate needs. Empowered kindness differs from doormat niceness. Chronic apologizers confused the two, believing that kindness required constant accommodation and apology. Real kindness comes from wholeness rather than depletion. You can be genuinely kind when you're not exhausted from managing everyone's emotions and absorbing Everyone else blame. Jennifer discovered she was actually kinder after transformation than before. Previously, her niceness had been performance mixed with resentment. She'd accommodate while silently resenting the imposition. She'd apologize while internally feeling misunderstood. The mismatch between external behavior and internal state created inauthenticity that people sensed. After transformation, her kindness was genuine because it came from choice rather than compulsion. She helped when she genuinely wanted to help. She supported when she had capacity to support. The help and support were real rather than resentful compliance with expected role. The final permission is this: you don't owe anyone an apology for existing, not for taking up space, not for having needs, not for holding boundaries, not for prioritizing yourself appropriately, not for being imperfect, not for disappointing people who expected you to be endlessly accommodating. You owe genuine apologies when you cause actual harm through your actions. You owe accountability when you violate commitments or act carelessly in ways that damage others. But you owe no apologies for being human with normal human limitations, needs, and boundaries. The apology trap was never about being polite. It was about being small, about making yourself lesser to make others more comfortable, about accepting blame that wasn't yours to carry, about managing emotions that weren't yours to manage. You're not small anymore. You're whole. And whole people apologize when appropriate while standing full when it's not. This is who you are now, not who you're becoming. Who you already are through every choice you've made to break free from patterns that never served you. Michelle got the job. Jennifer built genuine relationships. You have everything you need to do the same. Now go take up space.